It is the last day of the month, Minties. That means I have to do a reading order for the month of April. And the Patreons, thank you all so much, by the way, to our existing patrons, voted for the Duck Comics by Carl Barks reading order. So, please stay tuned. And welcome back, Minties. Now, before I get started, I want to give a huge shout out and a huge thank you to our patrons that voted for the Duck Comics. I have been wanting to do the Carl Barks Ducks reading order for quite some time now, and it seems to have been outvoted so many times. So thank you all. Every month on our Patreon, I put up a reading poll as to what I should be doing next, and I leave it up to the patrons to vote. So I'll be working on the month of May sometime in the next couple of weeks. Another huge shout out to my wonderful wife, the astonishing Melanie, who volunteered to help me with the indexes. And this entire reading order is going to be done different than I normally do. Basically because of the way that Fantagraphics has been publishing these. I'll talk a little bit about the man himself, Carl Barks. I'll talk about the actual library editions. And then, of course, the impact that his stories had on the world. Another thing to note is as I put the little index boxes somewhere on the screen, there are going to be some shortened words, such as the 4-color comics will be shortened to one-shots, and Walt Disney's comics and stories will just be comics and stories, so keep that in mind. And again, thank you to my wife for these amazing bookends that she made. So, let's get started with Christmas on Bear Mountain. About as tall as a trade paperback, but longer. So we're looking at the height of a standard edition hardcover, and not as tall as a deluxe edition. So that's something to keep in mind, because the Don Rosa library is taller. Let's get this open and show you what each of these books is like. Like I mentioned, this is going to be a different kind of reading order. So you have Donald Duck by Carl Barks, Christmas on Bear Mountain. This is volume 5. So one thing to keep in mind is that these are done in non-chronological order when they're released. They still have not released volumes 1 through 4 yet. And here is volume 5. This volume starts off with issue 178 of the 4-color one-shots. And that is the first appearance of Scrooge McDuck. This guy right here. So this is his first appearance in a comic book everywhere. Now, let's keep on moving because we have a lot to talk about, and I just want to showcase some of the art in each book. The retail price for each of these books is around $28.99 to $29.99. It varies. Each one of the books is about 200 pages or plus. Sometimes it's up to 240 pages. They give you a table of contents in each of the books. And then you have the actual stories in here. And before we move away from Volume 6, this is also the first appearance of Gladstone Gander. And Gladstone is Donald's lucky cousin. He first appears in the Walt Disney's Comics and Stories issue 88. Now let's move on to what else is collected in here, because you have a series of what is known as the humorous adventure stories. Those are usually about 24 to 32 pages. And then you have 10-page comics. They were usually the lead for the monthly flagship titled the Walt Disney's Comics and Stories. And then you have the one-page gag stories. So, towards the end of his run on the Duck Comics, that's what he was doing. He was doing those one-page gag stories. Let's go in the back, because all of these books are meant for any age. Anybody, your kids, yourself, your grandparents, your parents can read these books. Have about, like I said, 200 and so pages of content, and then the rest of the book are story notes with the covers by comic historians. There are notes here talking about where Carl Barks was at the time of his life writing these stories, how each story came about, how each story probably influenced something else. And then you have Carl Barks, it's written by Donald Alt, The Life Among Ducks. It talks about his life and how he got started. And I'll be talking a little bit about that as I go through the volumes. Then there's biographies with all the people that helped out putting this book together, and where the stories first appeared. And this is what makes it really difficult, because a lot of these stories are usually reprints. A lot of these stories appeared in only in Europe. So that was part of the problem why I needed help putting this together, and that's where my wife came in to kind of do the research as to what we could leave out from what is collected in these books. So you have an introduction in some of these. Now this is the 7th volume, right? Lost in the Andes. However, this is the very first volume that was released in 2011. And it has the story of Lost in the Andes, which is a classic Donald Duck adventure story where Donald discovers these square eggs, and then a trip takes him to the Andes. So Donald and his nephews go to this strange land where everything is square, square chicken, square eggs, and everything round is wrong. It's a great story that actually Don Rosa did a sequel to. But yes, this was the very first book released by Fantagraphics in the Carl Barks Library collection. Now we're looking at Trail of the Unicorn, and as I mentioned, Lost in the Andes came out in 2011. Trail of the Unicorn came out in 2017, I believe, so about 6 years later. So like I said, these volumes are not released in chronological order. Now, there was one issue I didn't talk about in Lost in the Andes, but I'm going to talk about it here, and that is the Sunken Yacht, which was a 10-page story that Carl Barks did. And it's the story about how Donald attempts to salvage Scrooge's sunken yacht for a specific price, right? And he races the yacht by filling it with ping pong balls. That's how he's able to race the yacht. However, in the 1960s, I cannot remember the specific date, there was a Danish inventor that tried to salvage a sunken shipwreck by doing the exact same thing, by pretty much expanding these balls. And he tried to get a patent for this creation, and they denied him the patent because the way that he described it was the way that Carl Barks described it in his comics. And that comic, like I said, can be found in Lost in the Andes. And as I move through here, like I promised, I'm going to talk about Carl Barks. Now, Carl Barks was born in 1901, and he lived to be right at 99 years old. He died on August 25th of 2000, and he was known to introduce the world to this guy right here, Scrooge McDuck. And I'll talk a little bit about Scrooge in a little bit. Now, he worked in his career through animation, and then he made it into the comics world. Because mainly it had something to do with allergies. Like, he was an in-betweener at Disney Animation Studios. And if you don't know what in-betweener is, an in-betweener is the people that were in charge of drawing the in-between panels. So you have a team of artists, right, that is being supervised by one head animator who did the key poses of a character. That's what they were known as. Like, they would draw the key character, like Donald Duck, and then the in-betweeners did the drawings between the key panels. And that's what he did for a long time. As a matter of fact, in Disney, he started throwing his own little gag ideas, and the animation studio decided to make him into a storyteller as well. And he stayed there until, I believe, in the 40s is when he left. That was like in 1935, and then in the early 40s, he decided to leave due to his allergies. That's what happened. He left because of his allergies. Now, let's talk about another book. So before he left the studio, he was also doing some moonlight work as a comic book artist. And they offered him the job. Now, before I go any further, I do want to talk about the importance of this. This is the Terror of the Beagle Boys, which shows us the very first appearance of the Beagle Boys. That's right. He's not only created Scrooge McDuck, he also created the Beagle Boys, Gladstone, and I'll talk about all these characters as their first appearance comes about. And this one also has, in issue 134, sorry, not issue 134, it's issue 125, this one here. This is the first appearance of the Junior Woodchucks. They're kind of like Boy Scouts, right? And that is important to note, because we cannot not bring up DuckTales. Of course, that's one of the things I was going to talk about later on, but now that I brought it up, let the cat out of the bag. Of course, he was a big influential part of DuckTales. Don Rosa is the same way. And I'll talk about Don Rosa a little bit later. But let's keep moving and talking about Carl Barks. So Dell Comics approached him to do the 4-color comics. Those are what we're shortening it to, the one-shot, number 9. And that was published in October of 1942. And it was the very first Donald Duck story produced for an American comic book. And it also featured his nephews. So that is what he is known for bringing these animated characters and putting them into comic books. And he's also known for, just making a complex character out of Donald. Donald is kind of in the, not even kind of, he is dim-witted in the animation world, right? That's what we know. You can't understand anything he's saying. But here, he's actually pretty intelligent. Yes, he has a temper, right? But he's a pretty intelligent guy and kind of a complex character. Not as complex as my boy Scrooge, but still. By the way, this here has the first appearance, this volume right here, has the first appearance of Gyro Gearloose, who, of course, like I said, if y'all watch DuckTales, he first appeared in the comic books created by Carl Barks, and Scrooge is the one that always backs up his projects and experiments. So that's the first time you see him in the pages here. I think it's 140 of the one-shot, or the Walt Disney's Comics and Stories. And now we're going to look at Only a Poor Old Man. And you notice that it says Uncle Scrooge. Some of them say Donald Duck. Some of them say Uncle Scrooge. It really depends on who is featured there the most. Who is the featured character in these books the most. Of course, the earlier ones being Donald, right? Because Scrooge didn't appear until much later. And one of the things that you'll also notice is that these don't have volumes numbered. They don't have any volume numbers on them. And that's one of my things that a lot of my viewers have asked me about. They were like, hey Omar, can you do a reading order because I'm really confused? And if you look here, this is one of the earlier books, they don't even have what volume this is here. Later on they do. They kind of give you an idea as to what volume this is. This, for example, is volume 12, but you wouldn't know that unless you read what's collected in here and then try to put it together, or eventually get another volume down the road that has the actual volume numbers collected on the left-hand side, like I said, in the inner spine. I'll look at it here in a little bit. Now, it's amazing that a lot of these were not collected until this collection in 2011. Some of these stories that are from this volume here were previously collected in the Walt Disney's Uncle Scrooge McDuck, His Life and Times by Carl Barks. It's a beautiful, beautiful hardcover. One that I never ended up getting for some reason, because I guess I always had a hope that we would get something like this, a library collection in chronological order one day. Now, going back to Carl Barks' story, one of the things that I didn't mention is that he was born in Oregon, and then when he started working at Disney, he moved to California. But when he was in Oregon, he lived on a farm, and then eventually he tried to have his own farm. So he did, the typical farmer things and try to have animals and vegetables, gardens, and things like that. So what's interesting is that there's a story here in the Walt Disney's Comics and Stories number 146, and he has been interviewed in the past, when he was still alive, of course, that it was his favorite story. It's literally the story of Donald Duck retelling how he used to own a chicken farm. And it was in a town, I think it was like Omelette. But anyway, and probably one of the reasons why this is Carl Barks' favorite story is because, he himself worked with chickens, and I'm sure he adapted a lot of his life stories into his comic books. Oh wait, and this also has issue 149 in it, which is the first appearance of Daisy's nieces, April, May, and June. So it's important to note that because later on they were used in animation. You 100% can make any of these hardcovers your very first Duck comic. They're not really dependent on what happened in the previous volume or what happens afterwards. Yes, here and there, characters that appeared earlier come back, but there's not really like an overall arc. They're all independent and stand out on their own. They can each be read independently. Now, before I go any further, I just want to remind you all to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel if you haven't subscribed yet, because we put out videos every day. And don't forget to hit that notification bell, or ring that bell for notifications to let you know when our videos are going live. We can also be found on Patreon and Redbubble, and those are great ways to support the channel. Now, the important thing to talk about this, before I go any further with Carl Barks' story, is this story right here, The Seven Cities of Cibola, which a famous writer, author, movie script writer, and director borrowed a few things from here heavily for a little movie called Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. So that's right, George Lucas, Steven Spielberg borrowed this scene right here, where it's not Scrooge McDuck, but it's the Beagle Boys taking this little totem right here, and it kicks off this boulder. And I know you all are familiar with the boulder scene from Indiana Jones, and I think that is probably one of the coolest things that, and George Lucas doesn't hide the like that he came up with the idea or anything. He admits that he got the idea from Duck Comics, and I think that's wonderful. And that's what kind of impact a lot of these books have on the world that you may not even realize where it originated from. Of course, you know, Carl Barks himself also borrowed from other storytellers like Little Nemo, Winsor McKay's little comic strips. But I think it's really cool that directors and screenwriters have also borrowed from comic books. By now, I think this is volume 15, and as promised, this is what I was going to show you all. See what I mean? This is the only place you can find where the volume numbers are from previous collections. So right there. The crazy thing to me, and this makes perfect sense, is that back then, back in the 40s when he first started drawing Duck Comics, all the way up until the 60s, nobody really knew who drew these books. That's why Carl Barks is known as the good duck artist. That's all kids knew him as, or adult collectors, right? Don Rosa. They didn't want anybody else drawing the Duck Comics. They just wanted the good duck artist. And it wasn't until, like I mentioned, like in the 60s, that his identity like remained a mystery the entire time. But then many readers started recognizing his work and drawing style. And then, like I said, you know, they sought him out. They try to find him and to try to reveal like his true identity. I think that is such an interesting story because there sadly is a lot of writers and artists that are no longer with us that will forever remain mysterious and unknown because we didn't know. They didn't label. Everything was Disney. And the crazy part is that even though his identity wasn't known, he was still writing and drawing these books. He was still writing the adventures of Donald, the nephews, and Scrooge. And I think that's really cool. Like, he didn't care. It was a paycheck, right? I don't think it's until later on that a lot of writers and artists want some kind of recognition. Nowadays, you know, you wouldn't see things like this. You wouldn't see Marvel Presents with no known artist, no known writer. It's unheard of. But back then, it was a very common thing. They just wanted the Disney name on these characters, and a lot of, like I said, there's been a lot of writers that are not identified. Now, he went on to keep writing and drawing some of these stories. Like, he semi-retired in the late 60s, but I think in the early 70s he was still doing some Scrooge stories. Not very much, though. I think he was doing one-pagers, and I think that's what's going to happen with these library editions, is eventually we're going to get into the one-page stories and less of the adventures of 24 to 32 pages and even the 10-page stories. So let's talk about these library editions. So what the library editions are going to do, and what they've been doing, is collecting everything that was originally published by Carl Barks and Dell Comics and wherever he was from 1942 until his retirement, like I said, in 1966. I don't know if they'll collect the later stuff when he was coming back and doing things in the early 70s. The first book that came out was in 2011, and we're getting 2 books a year. So that's something to keep in mind, right? By the end of it, like I said, these books have like 200 to 240 pages each. So here's something else to have in mind. We're looking at around 30 volumes. And if we're looking at 30 volumes at 2 volumes a year, if you're doing some really quick math, we're looking at 2026 when this library collection is open. It's completely done. So in about 6 more years, right? That's crazy to think about. But then I remember, like, when they did the Peanuts collection, right? I remember the first time I got the Peanuts hardcover. In no time, though I think it was a total of 10 years, those 10 years came and went. In between that time, I I transferred jobs, I got married, I had kids, bought a house. It's amazing what's happened in my life in those years. But then I think about it, this is everything that he did from 1942 to 1966. And really, to wait 6 more years on everything else, it's not that bad. This is somebody's lifetime achievement. This is everything that he put into it. His own sweat, blood, all the love that he put into these characters, especially Scrooge. So let's talk about Scrooge. My favorite anthropomorphic animal, Scrooge McDuck. I've done episodes on the channel about duck comics and their importance to me. I've done my 20 favorite non-superhero comics, and it always comes back to Scrooge. Of course, I mentioned Don Rosa instead of Carl Barks, but that's for another video. Actually, if you do want to see where these books continue, please let me know, or how they continue. Because there's a lot of stuff that has been released in Europe that has not been translated over here. Not until recently. But we finally have like all the Don Rosa library collection. So if you want to see those, let me know in the comments down below. If you want to see the Disney Masters box sets, let me know. Or I think IDW released a series of just, unfortunately, 3 hardcovers of the Timeless Tales from European creators. But Scrooge has always been one of my favorite characters. And it's mainly just the way that he's written, right? It's mainly that he comes from nothing and built himself from that. And he always remembers his past, right? He's tougher than the toughies and smarter than the smarties. His money bin that he dives into is a representation of his entire life. Not a quadrillionaire? I can't even remember what he is anymore. I can't keep up with what's been retconned. But it's insane that I really relate to this duck that is let's just say quadrillionaire, for the sake of saying it. I have nothing in common with this guy, but it's not until you read these stories by Carl Barks, by Don Rosa, that you start understanding that, damn, there is a lot more human in this character being written than any other comic book I've ever read. And that's what I love about him. He's a smart, wealthy business guy. Like I said, he's a self-proclaimed adventurous capitalist. And he really takes the dominant role when it comes to these adventures. When the nephews and Donald join him on adventures, it's always him that's leading the way. And the crazy part is, the way that he started out was nothing like the character that he became. I mean, obviously he was named after Ebenezer Scrooge from A Christmas Carol, right? And he was this greedy old man when he first appeared in the Christmas on Bear Mountain story. But the popularity grew so much with people that were reading this book that he became a major figure in the Duck universe. And then, like I said, in 1952, he got his own comic book series just called Uncle Scrooge, which runs until this day. I believe now IDW holds the rights. I can't keep up with who owns the rights to what. But that is crazy that this duck that started off like a jackass, like a jerk, like a greedy old man, just grew in popularity. And the more and more he appeared, the more the audience demanded his own comic book. And I think that's really awesome. And this all has to do with Carl Barks and the way that he wrote him. Not for him, we wouldn't have things like DuckTales, right? Or this new season of DuckTales. Without Carl Barks, there would be none of that. Now, Carl, like I said, he came back for a little bit. Mr. Barks came back for a little bit, like in the early 70s. And he did a little work, little comic strips. I think he did like a Daisy Duck comic book. I think that's what's known as the last book that he drew. But then he started doing oil paintings. And then these oil paintings were being auctioning off by Disney. And he was able to make a profit out of that. He was still going to conventions all the way like up until the mid 90s. It's insane. Like he was in his 90s and he was still attending conventions. And if you all know anything about Duck comics, they are huge everywhere else with the exception of the United States. And that's part of the reason why I do these comprehensive reading orders, especially for this, because this to me is one of the best comic books ever written. Okay, let's move on to this one. I believe this is volume 20. Actually, this has Uncle Scrooge number 15, which is the very first appearance of his arch nemesis, Flintheart Goldglum. And it's not his only arch nemesis, but it's his very first rich duck arch nemesis. Now, to get back to Carl Barks, as I mentioned, he did some oil paintings, started going to conventions and attended conventions up until he couldn't. Eventually, he ended up retiring from everything. moved back to Oregon, and I believe he was diagnosed with leukemia after his third wife passed away. I think he stopped doing chemotherapy, and then on August 25th, 2000, he passed away at the age of 99. We could only all live to be that old, to see the world change, to see what you have contributed to this world and how it changed everything. That would just be amazing. But yeah, that's pretty much it. You probably remember, like I said, he's the one that created Gyro. And what's interesting is that when Carl Barks left, Don Rosa only writes stories with Carl Barks characters. He doesn't care about any other creator other than the good duck artist. And that's the legacy that he left behind. And anytime you talk to Don Rosa, he will tell you no other duck comics exist with the exception of Carl Barks. Let's look at this final volume and talk a little bit about it. So this is the last book right here. This is Christmas in Duckburg. And I say last book for now, because we have one that's coming out in June, and that is, I believe, the 24 karat moon, I think. That will be volume 22, and it comes out in June. We still have a lot of things to collect. Yes, I mentioned that eventually we're probably it's going to be a collection of nothing but the one-pagers. But we still have things like the first appearance of Magic of the Spell, or his other rich arch-nemesis, John D. Rockerduck. Right? We still have to wait for those first appearances. So there's still a lot more to collect. 2 a year. One of the things that I didn't mention is how these have been restored. The actual collections. Like the colors and everything. It's really cool because what they did, instead of reprinting the original off-register colors, they ran the original art and let a computer system do the computer recoloring, even though it doesn't look like it, but that's how they managed to do this. One of the other things that I did not mention, but I'm sure you could tell when I was flipping through here, is that these books are completely uncensored, including the racial caricatures that appear throughout these pages. I believe Don Rosa tweaks them a little bit to make them seem less racist, but there's an intro that talks about that, and just these were books of their time and things like that. But until we get more, this is the last book. I hope I did not bore you that much. And if I did, I'm sorry. Now, if you're interested in any of these books, please check out our sponsor, cheapgraphicnovels.com, your online home for brand new graphic novels and collected editions up to 50% off the cover price. Cheap Graphic Novels prides itself on packaging your books so they arrive safely and in excellent condition, as well as prompt and helpful service. And check out their bargain bin for even greater deals up to 90% off cover price. And for you minties, Cheap Graphic Novels is running a special promotion. If you're a first-time customer, let them know you were referred by Near Mint Condition at the checkout, and you'll receive a credit for free shipping on your next order. Now, this is only for U.S. customers. Cheap Graphic Novels, your source for the hottest books with the kind of deep discounts, quality shipping, and customer service that will keep you coming back for more. And that was the reading order of the Carl Barks Duck comics that are out so far. Let me know in those comments down below if you're picking these up. If you've never read any of the Duck comics, if you want me to do an overview of the Don Rosa box set, or any of the other Duck comics that have followed Carl Barks, please don't forget to hit that like, subscribe button, ring that bell for notifications to let you know when our videos are going live. Again, thank you so much to our patrons for voting for this reading order. I'll be working on the reading order for May sometime in the upcoming weeks. Remember, everybody, please stay healthy, please stay safe out there, and much love to all of you.